Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Bauscher. Welcome to this session of headed Transforming Public Procurement, ? Issues of culture, outcomes, transparency and learning in the UK government's post-Brexit public procurement law reform proposals. I think, in preparing for this event, we've slightly reinterpreted the title to broaden it. And we'll have sort of three silos or categories of discussion this morning, the way we're going to work it. But before I talk you through that, let me talk to you a little bit about who you're going to hear from. As I've said, my name is Michael Bauscher. I am a barrister and practitioner in the field of public procurement, and I also teach public procurement law on various courses at King's College London, both on the master's course and on and direct a distance learning course. And I speak fairly widely around the world on this topic. At least it used to be around the world. Now it's all from my desk here. Welcome to where we are today. We've got a large number of highly qualified people to talk on various aspects of the subject this morning. They all have very considerable achievements which you will want to know about, but it will take up much of the morning if I regale you with each of their CVs. So please do look at them on the online information about this session. You'll find for each one there is a snappy profile which will give you the key information, which will tell you why you need to hear from that person. Because for each of them, they have very, very relevant knowledge and experience on the topics that we're going to cover. Also, in terms of the team, we have Rory McDonald, who is obviously knows far more about how this session is going to run than me. He will be our assistant chair today. We have Lee Rowley, who is, I believe, the online captain, who will be managing those who are online. And then Mara was somewhere who will be managing those who are physically in the room. We are sort of part online, part physical. We're moving to the next stage of our high flex environment, where we're trying to do events that are both online and physical, and I hope that's going to work. So if you have something that you want to raise, do put your hand up either virtually in the normal fashion, or put something in the chat, or put your hand up in the real world, and Rory will manage the traffic in the room, and we hope that we'll be able to get to you all as we go. The way the session is going to pan out is that we're going to start first with a session on the challenges simply of planning and drafting public procurement legislation. We're going to look at that from two perspectives. Firstly, the perspective of the drafting legislation, what one might call from scratch. We're very privileged to have two participants joining us from Lebanon. Lebanon has been putting together its own new public procurement legislation, and they will talk to us about that experience. And others will comment on that. I'll come back to who's going to be on that panel in a moment. We then, after half an hour or so on that topic, I will then pick up questions on that topic for 5 minutes or so, and we'll then move on to the next important, modern topic, which is open contracting and open government. And again, we'll hear from a number of key individuals who are focused on this very important aspect, the whole open contracting program, and how we can make procurement law match up with the goals of that. Again, then we'll have, say, half an hour on that topic, and we'll have done a few questions. We will then move on to the very pressing topic as to how we manage to balance the need for public procurement to do its job of procuring services, supplies, goods, but also to ensure that it delivers on the wider public goals, social goals, environmental goals, and so forth, which we're so focused on at the moment, and how we deal with all of those different policy and regional pulls on the regime, and we'll hear from those who are trying to develop the law and policy in that area. I'm hoping that will leave enough time for at least 20-25 minutes discussion at the end, when panelists and members of the audience can dive in, and that should, I hope, bring us to an elegant close at 11:30. If it works beautifully, that'll be wonderful. Bear with us if there are glitches. So, coming back to our first topic, I've already highlighted the fact that we're going to hear from Lamia Bissat and Basma Khalek, who are going to talk in a moment about their experience in putting together the Lebanese procurement legislation. To introduce the topic, we're going to hear from Caroline Nicholas. I'll come back in a moment, and then two other perspectives of experience in this field. Alison Jones, professor at King's College London, who will I'm sure tell you that she's not a procurement lawyer. That's not really true. She knows a great deal and has recently been published on a number of relevant procurement law topics, but her background is in competition law, and her particular interest is how we, in developing public procurement law, how we reconcile the needs of public procurement law and integrate that with other legal constraints, competition law, anti-corruption law, and so forth. And then Malcolm Harbour, who will be very well known to many of you as having particularly relevant past experience as MEP and chair of the Internal Market Committee when the 2014 EU directives were going through the European Parliament, and we'll have a lot of insight as to how that process went, but again, has continued his interest in public procurement law and deep involvement. I'm sure he will tell us about his perspective on that in due course. So, to kick off today's proceedings, Caroline Nicholas is going to talk to us from UNCITRAL in Vienna. Caroline has been at the heart of the UNCITRAL work on public procurement. Indeed, I first met her when she was chairing, leading the work at the UN on the current version of the UNCITRAL model law with enormous skill and patience. But I think the first time we met was actually the first go we had at, or you had at, putting together the frameworks section of the law, which was really was troublesome. Caroline probably has had more experience and more diverse experience than anyone of how to put together procurement law, how to bring it into legislation, and then how to actually deliver a piece of legislation as a working legal document that actually is integrated into legal systems around the world. Caroline, do please take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I'd just like to thank everybody for the opportunity to talk this morning, because I think the question of transforming public procurement and the legal issues are very, very important and often somewhat overlooked at the big picture level. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about what legal reform in public procurement actually means. And where we start. So UNCITRAL, as you've kindly indicated, has a model law on public procurement. It is literally that. It is a template that you can download from the UNCITRAL website in UN official languages, and you can use it to put your public procurement law in place. Now, I've worked with countries, as Michael's kindly said, all over the world, and some people use that template just to put in a few provisions, for example, on framework agreements, as Michael's mentioned. Others literally copy and paste the whole thing. And I have seen some examples of people copying and pasting, and the lawyers among us will appreciate this, the bits in square brackets that say, please complete as you want, just left in there like that. So we have a very wide diversity of users. UNCITRAL itself is founded very much on the principle of giving developing countries a voice. So when we were dealing with the draft of the model law, we listened to experience from all over the world. So the model law itself is a distillation of what we think are good practices, I hesitate to use the term best practices, for public procurement systems everywhere in the world. That obviously means that it's a fairly high level, but it does have sufficient detail and principles and procedures to cover the essential parts of your procurement law. The thing with starting a procurement law reform is you don't start from a blank sheet of paper. Almost all countries have signed up to the UN Convention Against Corruption, and that requires that the procurement law be based on principles of transparency, competition, and integrity or objectivity in decision taking. Many countries now have signed up to one form of free trade agreement or another, or the World Trade Organization's agreement on government procurement, and those have largely consistent approaches that also operate as either facilities or constraints, depending on your point of view, and set minimum standards for your procurement law. So you also have to think about what are your international commitments, and only when you've really set out that background can you start to think about what source you might use for your procurement law. And in general terms, most places these days do start from a previous edition of a procurement law. So what's worked, what's not worked, what do you want to change? So really, it's not a plug and play situation. And although there are different sources of international law with different concepts of how binding they are on individual countries, and some of them operate on a free trade basis, some of them on a trade liberalization basis, some focus on avoiding corruption. The good news is that there is general consensus on the key principles and procedures and the issues to address in the law. So it doesn't really matter which your basic source is, the key principles will be the same. The difference between the UNCITRAL model and others is that it is designed from the national perspective. It starts from that, not from another principle such as fighting corruption or whatever it is. However, there is considerable discretion and latitude in how you implement something in that a law in your country. And the UNCITRAL experience, and as Michael has just indicated, that your local circumstances and your other laws are very, very important. How you budget, what your electronic commerce law might look like, what your anti-corruption provisions are, what competition policy you have. So the background work that you need to do before you even start is the key thing. You have to understand your context. Are you an archipelago like Indonesia with huge issues about transport of goods? Are you a really advanced, electronically sophisticated country like Latvia? That context is really important because your law has to sit in your system. And finally, as time is pressing, I just want to say, speaking as a lawyer, the other thing we have to be so careful of, as Michael indicated, is that the law is just a part of your procurement system. And one of the key things I always say is you can have a great law and a lousy system. If you want to take a sort of concept, if you think about the human body, the law is the skeleton. You need the skeleton to stand up, but it only works because of all the other bits, the soft tissue, the brain, and all the rest of it. And that's the implementation and the effective thinking behind the policies and so on that Michael alluded to. So I'll stop there, Michael. I hope that's a small background, and I hope that we'll have lots of challenging questions for me to say they're interesting. I'm not quite sure how to answer them later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That's great. So the title of this session focuses on the fact that the UK is trying to reform its public procurement law, and we'll hear no doubt a lot about that in the rest of the session. But it's perhaps useful to hear from the experience of those who've really been trying to start from perhaps have the enviable opportunity to write a procurement law without being saddled with all of the history and legislative and otherwise, which we're having to work with in the UK. And so it's a great privilege to hear today from our two participants from Lebanon. Lamia Mouaye Bissat, you will read her very distinguished career is described online. I'm very keen always to make sure that we remind ourselves that we're not just procurement geeks at these events. We also have a life. And Lamia was kind enough to tell me that she's very keen on both karate and rock and roll. So we'll see how that develops going forward. Basma Abdul Khalek is an economist. Again, her background is described online. She's been working with a team of specialists on the public procurement reform over recent years, leading to the enactment of this law. And she's indicated to me that her interests are clearly very diverse, both thalassophillia, which I think is genuine relaxation by the seaside, but maybe broader than that. Maybe Basma can explain. But also lies in the area of Greek philosophy, particularly Plato. Now, which suggests an idea that I've never yet made any of my students write an essay on what did Plato say about public procurement. I'm sure he said something, and if I'd been in Oxford, that would have been the right place to really get to the bottom of that topic. But Southwest London traffic prevented me from getting there today. But anyway, maybe that's a topic for another seminar. Without wasting any more time, Lamia, Basma, please tell us about your Lebanese experience.
Thank you, Lake, for this introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I really want to thank the Government Lab and the University of Oxford for this opportunity, for accepting to hear also the voice of Lebanon. My colleague Basma and myself are very pleased to share the lessons learned from Lebanon, and you will see why it's such an interesting experience. Because reform is coming at a time where a forward-looking implementation plan also is being finalized with our partners at the World Bank, the AFD, and hopefully soon the Open Contracting Partnership. And this is laying the ground for some smart and sustainable policy choices in a very, very, very difficult time. So it's a crisis, but it's an opportunity. So this whole of government, whole of society exercise coming in a crisis condition is led by the Institute of Finance, which I have the pleasure to lead since a couple of years. It's an autonomous public agency mandated to improve financial governance in Lebanon through better policies, through capacity building, and the Institute sustains very strong partnership with the MENA region and also at global level. Few words on Lebanon's economy, just to put you in context. Today, it in deep crisis, ranked in the top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century. So in October 2019, a sudden stop in capital inflow precipitated banking debt and currency crisis, compounding on COVID-19 pandemic, the fallout from the Syria war and the blast at the port of Beirut in August 2020. All this tripled the unemployment rate in less than 3 years to 40%, caused 88% loss of purchasing power and a 9-fold decrease in the minimum wage. Now, worldwide, inequality between places is a major source of social anxiety and political disruption, as you well said in the introduction. But on a regional scale, no society is more marked by inequality than Lebanon. With a Gini index score of 0.8, the country is ranked among the 10 most unequal countries in the world in terms of wealth distribution. Public procurement is a big reason for that, because it's a big business, as Nigel Ball, ED of the Government Lab, puts it, and it has been really the realm of the capture. So it represents 8% of Lebanon GDP, but it is largely subject to mismanagement, and it is really an entrenched state capture. Bad procurement, bad mismanagement of the energy sector alone costed, ladies and gentlemen, the country half of its debt. So on the occasion of the donor conference, community conference that was calling for reforms, structural reforms first, public procurement was on the plate as the top-notch priority. And the Lebanon procurement system lags behind all countries of the region, including Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, as evidenced by international report. Inefficiencies, waste, of course, of public money, lack of competition, etc. You know the rest. But after we decided to embark on this very long process, and after these 2 years, modern and unified public procurement law was promulgated on June 30, 2021. And this is a transformative approach to the structural reforms that we are intending to apply. How we did that, it is because we approach it in a different way. Until now, most laws have been not staying in Parliament for 8, 10, 12 years. This one got enacted in less than a year. Of course, there is a push from the international community, but there are also the basis on which the law was built. So evidence and benchmarks. This is number one. This is mostly the MAPS exercise, but also leveraging the experience of the region, basing ourselves on UNICITRAL as a model law, and the OECD recommendations. So UNCITRAL, dear Caroline, was extremely convincing and as a strong argument for moving on the parliamentary discussions. The second item in this approach was mostly using the principle. So the essence of the reform was to advance the principle to the forefront, and every article was related to a principle. So it was very hard to break the chain, even for those who came with a lot of resistance. The third pillar of the approach was transformation. So public procurement system, in that sense, we saw them as key enablers of social transformation. And here, the role of responsible businesses, of media, of community group was pushed to its maximum. It was weighed through continuous dialogue, through immersion of these stakeholders in the making of the law. So judiciary, public leaders, responsible businesses spent a lot of time with us working on the law. And this cross-sector partnership, considered from the start as key to improving the social outcome. So we worked at having each stakeholder an owner of the law. So the third point is worth observing, and this is the parliamentarian. But my colleague Basma will talk about the relation with the parliamentarian very briefly.
Yes, good morning to all. I'm happy to join this panel to continue what Lamia started by saying. On this third point, particularly that is worth observing is the change in policymakers' behavior throughout the process of discussing the law in Parliament. They accepted 3 new ways of working on this law, namely the openness to stakeholders' views and concerns. Second, the engagement with subject matter experts who provided advice and technical assistance. And third, bringing society to the level of action. On openness to stakeholders' views and concerns, public administration, business community, civil society organizations were all invited to Parliament to express their views and concerns. And this is new for Lebanon. They were also asked to provide a written feedback on the very first draft of the law in order to introduce enhancements. And this also helped in mitigating risks of non-constructive feedback later on and resistance to change. Second, on the engagement with subject matter experts, in the midst of the profound crisis of trust in the ability of policymakers to objectively lead crucial reforms in Lebanon, policymakers accepted a specialized team in public procurement because this law is particularly of high technicity. So parliamentarians are not familiar with public procurement issues and subject matter. So the Institute team served as experts that provided technical assistance and exposure to their international practices to policymakers in order to facilitate the discussions. And we really played the role of a bridge builder in this concern. And parliamentarians were quoted requesting similar approaches to be applied to other reform laws and and crucial structural reforms in the country. And could be also considered a takeaway for other developing countries and context of the MENA region to apply the same process. On working with society and bringing them to the level of action, this is very, very important because we all know that civil society organizations have an ordinary approach and a normal approach of voicing their concerns and maybe advocating to change. But here we engage them in a more structured way through training, awareness raising, a dialogue with activists, media, and all organizations. And we succeeded in leveling up their contribution, otherwise very limited. Public procurement has become a topic that made the news on a recurrent basis. So public procurement law is now considered a main instrument in the society to inform public at large how taxpayers' money is spent or misspent, and also to allow monitoring of government spending practices. Very quickly on the governance model, because this is also very interesting. In Lebanon, this is a first procurement law that is unified and modern. Our old legislative framework is scattered. This is the first time we enact a public procurement law per se. And the governance that was highlighted in its provisions is as of importance of the law itself. So pressure from both stakeholders and the international community pushed parliamentarians to agree on a governance model that sends a positive signal of trust to investors, to donors, and to the society at large. So two main institutions are being created through this law, a regulatory body that will be responsible for guidance, for monitoring, for putting procurement policies on the long term, like sustainable procurement or encouraging SMEs to enter the market, and for collecting and making data open and available to all. And the second institution is a review and complaints body, which is also the backbone of the system that will allow potential bidders and suppliers to file complaints, to making sure that by accessing fair, transparent, and speedy process of complaint management, they are increasing their chances to compete in this market. So to conclude on the way forward, Lamia.
Yes, few final words. I totally agree on Caroline's statement. The law is only one piece of the puzzle. You need also the right institutions and the right measures. So this is why we're working a lot on a series of actions on the legal, institutional, and operational level, of course, with our partners. However, many questions remain, and we ask ourselves to what extent incorporating social value in a staggering inequality context will succeed in capturing opportunities for economic recovery and prosperity, for ensuring open and free access to data for better transparency. We have lots of questions about that. Will the Lebanese parliament continue supporting and nurturing cross-sector partnership to advance PP reform? Will responsible businesses, media, and community be able to sustain their effort in the midst of extreme humanitarian and economic crisis of the country? Will the intersecting layers of central and local government be able to work with each other to create the conditions for success of this law and also such a tough context? And how would the talent drain, the hemorrhage, if I might say, in government affect this reform and the future of governance in Lebanon? This is the crisis marked by the largest exodus of talent from the country and let alone from the government. Thank you, University of Oxford and Government Lab for hosting Lebanon on this panel. And we keep our hopes high, and thank you and the audience for their interest, and looking forward to your feedback and interaction in the coming minutes. And please do not forget to visit the Institute's website to keep an eye on this country's experience. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So we've got a lot of people to get through, so we're going to try and keep everyone to sort of 5 minutes or so to comment on all of these issues. Let me just link Lebanon, that experience with our own situation here in the UK and pick up one or two of the questions so far. The problem, of course, here in the UK is that we've never really acknowledged the need for any public procurement law at all. It's been the reason why we have my cynical approach to this, and I'll invite others to knock this down, is that the only reason why we have a reform project on now is because of Brexit, because the political perception of those currently in power was that public procurement law was unnecessary, and the ultimate goal should be, in a truly Marxist way, to allow it to wither away and die, because in a great country such as Britain, we wouldn't need such law. Unfortunately, for a whole host of reasons, partly practical, partly because of the international constraints, some of which the UNCAC constraint that Caroline has referred to, the WTO constraints and other constraints, the reality has set in, and it has been discovered that we do need public procurement law. And so we have this reform project, which I think has a number of features, many of which will be somewhat disappointing all round, in the sense that there isn't that much change being suggested to public procurement law here that wouldn't already have been possible within the EU law constraints. So for those who wanted to wither the public procurement law to go away and die, it isn't going to. The real challenge now is to use this reform process, which has been sort of given to us, to try and make sure that we do achieve the important goals of environmental and social development, but also to integrate that with the fundamental needs to address the economic, the competition issues, the anti-corruption issues, which are at the heart of any public procurement law. And it's trying to integrate all of that within a process which I don't think was really adequately motivated by those sorts of issues to start with. But we really, those are the challenges that we're going to face over the next few months. Now, I've taken up a bit too much time. We all need to keep the pace going, but really picking up that issue of how to integrate procurement law with other areas of law. Alison Jones. Alison, where are you?
I'm here. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this very prestigious panel. And especially as Michael's already pointed out, I'm not a public procurement lawyer at all. I'm a competition law. But I just want to kind of pick up and highlight some of the points that have already been made by Caroline and Michael, and sort of highlighted as well on that fascinating presentation on the situation in Lebanon, the importance of, when designing, developing public procurement system, of really drilling down and considering how it's going to operate harmoniously with related laws, especially competition and anti-corruption laws. So everyone knows, it's well known that these systems are especially prone to distortion through both supplier collusion, where private contractors get together and rig bids for public tenders through bid suppression, bid rotation, market customer allocation, or cover bidding, and or corruption, with public officials steering contracts to preferred bidders in return for financial or other rewards. And we can just look around the world to find numerous instances of such practices being alleged or being uncovered, including or even especially in moments of crisis such as the current COVID pandemic. And we all know that when these practices of course occur, they will of course thwart the objectives of the public procurement system, and in particular, they will increase the cost or reduce the quality and quantity of the procured goods and services, to the detriment not only of the public purchaser, but of course those relying on those crucial public services that are meant to be being provided. So if a state does wish to reap the benefits of an efficient and effective procurement system, it must be able to defend its integrity by taking measures which will protect it against these two types of conduct. So policymakers and legislators, when developing or reforming public procurement systems, must try and ensure that the strategy unites public procurement, competition, and anti-corruption laws, by ensuring that these three sets of laws are united by a consistent policy and will work together to achieve those goals. They're not contradictory at all, and the overlaps between them are minimized. And another point highlighted already by Carolina and Michael and previous speakers is that in designing such a system, attention needs not to only be paid to the construction of the laws, the skeleton as Caroline referred to it, but also how they're going to be implemented, applied, enforced, and how coordination of all these various bodies is going to occur. So as Michael's already mentioned, in the UK, we appear to have a pretty comprehensive set of laws governing public procurement, bribery, competition laws, but there is still concern that a combination of factors may be reducing their effectiveness, whether that's weaknesses in the laws or how their public procurement laws themselves or how they're applied, weak or insufficient enforcement of the competition and anti-corruption laws, and really just a lack of policy coordination between the agencies. So just in conclusion, in designing or sort of performing a system, not only is it crucial to have a carefully constructed public procurement system, which minimizes corruption and collusion incentives and opportunities, but it's also necessary to have them sitting alongside robust competition and anti-corruption laws with proactive and independent officials with adequate powers to root out unlawful conduct and impose and seek effective sanctions, which will ensure that the benefits of infringement do not exceed the costs. So any effective system is going to require pretty close coordination between public procurement officials and competition and anti-corruption agencies. I could say more. I know the time is tight, so I will stop there and pass back to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So without more ado, let me turn to Malcolm Harbour, who brings vast experience of both legislative and working in public procurement after his legislative experience. Malcolm, how are we going to try and connect all of these dots in the current legislative reform program we have going in the UK, in 3 or 4 well-chosen words?
Well, thank you very much. That's a pretty tough ask, Michael, but I will do my best. But perhaps a little context, which I think is important. I was really delighted to see from the very interesting presentation from Lebanon that their parliament have been extensively involved in these discussions. And I think as an elected politician, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer by background, but one of the big challenges in dealing with very heavyweight technical legislation and with big legal ramifications like the Public Procurement Directive is building up a corpus of expertise to deal with it. And so just to share a bit of my past experience as having chaired the Parliament's Internal Market Committee during the time that we reviewed, amended and adopted a really big reform of the European public procurement law, which of course is a relatively mature system and has been through a whole range of amendments since it was first introduced at the foundation of the European single market, where it was seen to be a key instrument. Now, one of the ways that we did that was in anticipation of receiving a massive piece of legislation to look at. My committee set up two reports. We assembled people together, held public hearings, and we published 2 political reports, one 2 years and one 1 year before we received a proposal. And those political reports were really tightly focused on what we saw were the overall societal, economic, social benefits of public procurement, which we felt were considerably underutilized. Public procurement as a vehicle, and this is what I'm working on now, I think is significantly underestimated at the political level for its ability to generate and drive change, and also to encourage economic activity and particularly innovation. And if you looked at the European law, you will see all of those things worked through. And particularly because a lot of it came from my colleague who was a Green politician who produced a very balanced report, but had a strong element to the fact that public procurement was going to be critical in delivering a zero carbon economy in future. And that was well in advance of the current discussion. And also at a political level, we were very keen to encourage more innovation, which led directly to an entirely new procurement procedure, the innovation partnership, to try and move all of that forward. And that was extremely interesting politically, because when the governments of the European Union, and of course this is part of the tension there, which is still a unique system, of course, which we're not direct participants, but I think it has interesting lessons there, that actually when the governments looked at it, they said, well, we only want to see this innovation partnership as an optional instrument. And actually, as soon as we started the negotiations with them, that was the first thing we put on, and that was the first thing that they conceded, because it was absurd to have that key political objective not incorporated in all the legislation. Well, now, how are we moving forward? I think I agree very much with what Michael said, is that the proposed reform from the UK government at the moment really doesn't change the needle in terms of the principles and the depth of the reform of the 2014 regulations. And interestingly, I worked closely throughout that process with the Department of Business, and particularly with Francis Maude as the minister. And the UK transposed the European legislation from 2014 in about a year. It was an all-time record because BEIS was so interested in getting it into operation. Now, you didn't see any of that, by the way, in the consultation document on transforming public procurement. There was nothing about the background and how the UK had argued a case for all of these things in it. But I'm pleased to see they're in there. But my two closing points that I can linked into this, which I do think need to be taken strongly into account. We had a major battle again at a political level to try and make public procurement far more open and friendly to small businesses. And this, I think, is something that has not been covered properly in the Green Paper. And indeed, some of the reforms that we put into the European legislation have still not been really transposed and deployed even in the UK. And I think if we're going to have a dynamic and innovative economy, we must tackle that. And I noticed also that it's already in the chat about e-procurement. Europe has been very good in moving towards a commonized e-procurement platform where people who want to bid for public contracts can have a profile that's already existing. They don't need to repeat that every time if they want to bid for contracts. And that seems to be a fundamental piece of engagement that we ought to be adopting in the modern age that we live in. And of course, the whole issue about enhancing social value and how we're moving to the most economically advantageous tender and not procurement that's just based on a priced criteria, and have a structured mechanism to do that, to bring into account the other aspects that society expects from public procurement, are deeply embedded in the European legislation and are going to be in the UK legislation. And so in terms of engagement, it would have been, I think, helpful if the Department of Business and the Cabinet Office had engaged with people before they wrote the Green Paper and not after it. So I worked for 5 years with BEIS on that, and nobody ever asked me to contribute at all at any stage to the Green Paper, either before or after it was published.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. A couple more comments just coming up, but I'll study them and further. We might come back to them at the end. I think we probably, as points have been being raised, we've probably each of us have picked them up as we've been speaking. We can probably draw some of the threads together more at the end, and I'm anxious that we try and keep up the heady pace that we've already managed to achieve. So we've started with the sort of looking at the broad context. Let's look on at one particularly important area of modern thinking about public procurement, that is open contracting. The open contracting initiative has been very important in a number of countries. not only in the United Kingdom, but rather than my take up time by paraphrasing my understanding of it, let me not waste time on that. Let me turn immediately to Gavin Hayman, Executive Director of the Open Contracting Partnership, who is going to tell us about that. And I do recommend the Open Contracting Partnership's contribution to the reform, to the Green Paper reform process, which I don't know whether it's publicly available on the Open Contracting website, but if not, perhaps it might be useful, Gavin, if we could give people the link where people can reach it, because I think it's a very good summary of the issues. Over to you, Gavin.
Wonderful, thank you, Michael. And yes, I'll post it in the chat when I've kind of finished my remarks. So we do two things, the Open Contracting Partnership. We're a sort of silo-busting non-profit working around the world, and we want to kind of transform public procurement. And we really try to do that through better open data across the entire cycle of public contracts. Stephanie just put a comment in the chat about the importance of monitoring implementation of public contracts, just how vital that is to better social outcomes. I completely agree. Also, better planning for actually solving public problems and thinking about what you want to buy is also critically important. And then the second thing we do, as well as better open data on the entire flow, is an open, collaborative, multi-stakeholder approach to really rethink public procurement as user-friendly digital public service. We just had this great example from our Lebanese reforming champions who are really thinking that through and recognize it's a long journey that requires continued engagement and indeed re-education of politicians and others, throughout the process of what good could look like. So let's go to the UK. Now, it's absolutely clear UK public procurement has really struggled during the pandemic. We've seen both the kind of Hunger Games for lack of coordination across the public sector, and we've also seen this kind of special channels for favoured companies appearing, and it's actually kind of distracted from the work of frontline professionals at that point of emergency. It didn't have to be like this, and we work in about 30 countries around the world, and I'm really struck by how even much poorer countries with lots of resources have had a better response based around that data and better oversight and engagement and coordination. Quick example, take Ukraine, where emergency contracts were kind of posted in real time. They had embedded risk analysis and monitoring indicators based around the data from those contracts, looking at where the risks were. In the UK, we're still waiting 100 days plus to actually find out what the government bought and whether it was good value for money. And there's a big challenge with implementation there and actually whether the contract's delivered. So, to the Green Paper, there's a lot to talk about, but I know we're pushed for time, so I'm just going to make 3 key recommendations, kind of picking through it. Overall, I'm a fan of a lot of the recommendations and thought that's gone in. The devil will be in the detail of that, and it's really important that the government kind of carries on the multi-stakeholder engagement. It would have been great, for example, to have published everyone's input to the Green Paper, and then to have published the kind of consolidated response of what the government thinks about that. So the 3 things I think are super important. One is, there in Chapter 6, this proposal for end-to-end digital transparency of contracting information across the commercial life cycle. So from planning, tender and award, and over to implementation. Super important. Caroline was saying law is a skeleton. Really, the data is your nervous system, right? We want the body to move ahead and actually do things. You're going to need a nervous system to steer it, and actual data will be driving that change, who's buying well, who isn't, whether we're getting value for money or not, are we delivering the social value objectives or not. That's going to be absolutely crucial. You want that to be joined up machine readable open data across the cycle. And the Green Paper is proposing to adopt the open contracting data standard. It will probably just, in the primary legislation, talk about the need to publish open data, and then secondary legislation will talk about the implementation details. The Open Contracting Data Standard is a free open source way of unlocking, share that information with version control and with unique IDs for public contracts to follow them across their life cycle. It's been used in about 30 different countries around the world. It's been a real game changer for actually tracking and better delivery and better sort of value from public contracting. There's great evidence when you look at markets that actually better transparency leads to better engagement and better competition and a higher diversity of suppliers. And you can even see that even across the EU regulations, depending on who's got a good EGP system with good open data, and you can see the results of that. So one thing that Alison raised was the importance to think about this in the context of all the other legislation, and you're right that you should think about that in a holistic way. We tend to talk about open by design, intentionally sharing the information with key stakeholders to generate better outcomes, and that kind of intelligent user-centered approach to doing that will be a really important follow-up on the Green Paper proposals. It should be a tell us once principle that people have said, and really done well, you should lessen the burden on reporting for frontline procurement teams. So there's no need for them to have to fill in the information again. We can really use automation and digitization to have a huge saving of everyone's time and effort and get better information. Other people have done it. It isn't rocket science. It can be done in the UK. So last two quick closing comments. Secondly, changing the complaints mechanism. Again, we heard from Lebanon, that's one of the things they need to change as well. Far too much ends up in kind of post hoc litigation and damages in the UK kind of procurement system, which actually blocks innovation and people experimenting. The Green Paper proposes changing that to a much more kind of proactive remediation approach. I would agree in principle. The details of implementation will be terribly important. And lastly, just like, again, we've heard the value to have a kind of an independent unit to sort of oversee procurement with powers to review and if necessary intervene. We heard about that in Lebanon. Alison was saying about the need for better oversight. It's absolutely clear the UK market isn't coordinated. There's no one really taking a data-driven approach to look at what's working, what's failing, and that needs to change. And my very, very last comment, don't think about this as a cost, think about this as investment. You know, the return on investment we've seen other countries in public procurement reforms based around open data have been around 200 to 1. So, yeah, given that this is 1 in every £3 spent by the British government, the single largest pot of spending the government actually does, it's too important not to really focus on doing properly. Thank you.
Fantastic, Gavin. Let's stick on the open contracting point before we come back to some of the other issues that are being raised. We've got two more speakers who will be addressing this topic. And really, as I say, we've got their information online. So Sam Roberts, perhaps you can respond or comment on Gavin's introductory observations.
Thank you, Michael. Absolutely. And thank you so much for the invite to speak on this prodigious panel. So I am the head of open government policy within the Cabinet Office, within the Central Digital and Data Office, a newly formed part of the Cabinet Office, which is looking at some of the things that Gavin outlined. So things like the data quality, trying to improve the quantity and quality of open data that we publish. And the program that I deliver and run is effectively a way of civil society groups and external organizations being able to interface with government across a number of high priority areas. So the thing I really want to kind of talk about here is the importance of the engagement that we have with kind of experts in this space and the way that we're able to kind of use that expertise to drive government policy. So the UK is a founding member of the Open Government Partnership. This is something that Gavin alluded to in some of his comments. It's a coalition of over 70 countries that commit to values of transparency, accountability, and public participation in policy making. And as part of this area, as I said before, we create a mechanism and a space for civil society to approach government policymakers and discuss areas of high interest for the creation of commitments as part of our kind of biannual national action plans. And so I wanted to kind of mention one of the things around this, open contracting, open procurement, the open contracting data standard. These elements have always been very present and very kind of high on the agenda for each of the 4 national action plans that we have published previously. So since 2011, we've been publishing one every 2 years, and it's also obviously a very high, very high profile area for our latest action plan, which we're currently in the drafting stage of developing. We've made so many commitments over the years to this area, including things like the adoption of the open contracting data standard, improvement of the quality of data published onto Contracts Finder, and also greater publication of open data on procurement more broadly. I think it's been mentioned a few times that we are currently in the moment of a step change. There is a new potential for a new regime to be kind of created, and so as you've mentioned, the Green Paper is the way through that. But the team that are working on that area are very much engaged through this process as well, and the open government process is a way to kind of create that space and enable that conversation to take place. So as I mentioned, the most important aspects to our multi-stakeholder approach is to bring together all these different bodies, to bring together all these different people to talk about these things, and we also look internationally at kind of examples as well. So the way that we're able to work with these 70 plus other countries in the Open Government Partnership is that we're able to look at areas of good practice. So we've had some great experiences working, for instance, with countries like Colombia, with Ukraine, and the way that they're working in the procurement space. So we're able to kind of reach out and kind of have a really kind of smooth discussion of best practice in these areas as well. So, as I say, this is something that we've been developing over a long period of time, and in addition to the open procurement and open contracting things that are kind of being targeted, there's also a number of kind of open contracting and open procurement elements to a number of other kind of aspects of government policy that are of high interest in the public domain right now. So things like, for instance, climate change, more data on things like extractives, transparency, again, very much in this space of open contracting and open procurement. So as I say, through this mechanism, we're able to have these broader conversations, we're able to kind of bring in the right people from government to discuss them, and we're able to kind of, take on board the best practice that's happening internationally as well. So those are my points on open government. I'm happy to take any questions after this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. And then with a different perspective, I couldn't actually find Kevin Keith's profile on the website, but I'm told it's there somewhere, so it's probably my inadequacies in manipulating the website. I couldn't find Sam's and Kevin's information, but anyway, Kevin, and in the meantime, I'm sure someone will put up the link so that everyone can be directed to it. Kevin is going to also comment on the open contracting issue.
Yes, apologies. So I'm the chair of the UK Open Government Network, which was set up around 2012, 2013 to coordinate civil society input into the development of the UK's National Action Plan. Is working very closely with Sam, actually. Sam sort of coordinates from the government side, and I kind of lead the coordination of civil society side. In terms of, as Sam mentioned, the Open Government Partnership was set up in 2011. It was actually an idea from President Obama at the time, trying to instill these values of accountability, of transparency, a more participatory government, and trying to utilize the changes in technology. Great lofty principles, but the key thing is, how do you then turn that into action? How does that then translate into actual change? So the following year in 2011, an initial 8 countries came together and formed the Open Government Partnership. The UK was a sort of founding member. And the key thing really is to, every couple of years, to develop what's called a national action plan. So it's about turning those 3 principles, transparency, accountability, and more participatory government, into action. Normally on a sort of every 2 years, there's sort of 12 or 13 or so commitments. Open contracting has been quite a common theme, particularly around the use of data as technologies allow those changes to take place. There's a number of key things that I kind of wanted to talk about from a civil society perspective. And it is really around why civil society matters in this process. There's a number of reasons. The politics of this ebbs and flows, of contracting, of open contracting. About 5 years or so, there was a big anti-corruption summit in the UK, David Cameron sort of heading it up. And, in terms of, there was about 43 governments made 600 commitments. Organisations like Transparency International actually looked at what then happened to those commitments when there was this big groundswell of political interest, and they've actually found quite a lot dropped off, and a lot of them were too vague to even monitor. And so you can sort of see, whilst the political side ebbs and flows, now we're in a different stage now. The political attention is way back on this issue, and it's there for a number of reasons. As has been mentioned, obviously we've had the kind of global tragedy of coronavirus, and people have saw the life and death side of procurement and why it matters in terms of getting, PPE and various other things to people in an instant. And they've reflected on what some countries have done and what other countries haven't done. So that's a huge kind of groundswell of interest the public are looking into, and there's been high-profile cases of where various procurement rules have not been met. But secondly, from a UK perspective, there's a series of international summits where the UK is kind of leading on this as being chair of the G7, where anti-corruption was quite high, and open contract was part of that conversation. There's been this forthcoming Biden summit on democracy. I think that's sort of December 9th, 10th, later this year, where again, kind of open contracting procurement will be front and centre. Similarly, COP26 and the drive to ensure that we meet those UN sort of climate goals. So why does civil society matter in that? Well, it's a number of reasons. One, it's ensuring that when those kind of commitments are developed through the National Action Plan, and working with government to develop those commitments, or when those promises are made at summits, there is that kind of continuous sort of oversight. Now, what happens through the National Action Plan process is, yes, we come together as a group of civil society organisations, we work closely with government, but then the commitments put into the National Action Plan. But there's a mid-year kind of assessment point where we say, right, okay, how is this going? So that ensures that any commitment which is made in that National Action Plan, it has to be specific. It has to be something you can evaluate. It has to be something you can monitor. Otherwise, to be honest, it's not fulfilling the role. So at a half-yearly stage, we look back in and say, is this working? And civil society can hold government to account on that and use our friends in the media if we have to do so too. Also, it's kind of independently assessed. So the UK and its National Action Plan is kind of looked at from an external perspective and reviewed on that basis. Of course, as Sam mentioned, this is part of a global movement, but I think all of the people on this call, I suspect, are very interested in this, and there are various ways in which you can engage in the Open Government Partnership. Ruari MacDonald, who's actually on this call and part of facilitating, is the co-chair of the Open Contracting National Action Plan commitment from a civil society side, has put together a really interesting kind of concept and trying to marry, the interesting stage with the Green Paper and a lot of great proposals in there, trying to marry commitment with what's coming through the Green Paper and ensuring that's, as I mentioned, very specific and measurable. So hopefully you can sort of see why this process of engagement matters from a trust perspective, but from a kind of scrutiny perspective, the constant involvement of civil society to keep looking, to keep pushing, to keep pressuring and try where possible to maintain that political pressure is also absolutely vital too. Okay, thank you.
Great. We've had a lot of comments, but to some extent, I think they sort of cross over into the next panel as well. If I pick up sort of themes we've got so far, issues over performance, which is almost an invitation for me to tell people that we've seen performance of public contracts was so important. We've added a number of performance-related modules into our public procurement course, but there are structural reasons why EU law has not looked at performance. There are really conceptual reasons within EU law. So there may not be good reasons, but they are reasons why procurement law has tended not to look at performance, which has created a major issue going forward. And there's a sort of overarching issue which is bubbling away in the chat, which I will sum up as how do you constrain discretion so as to make sure that people don't have the opportunity to exercise discretion in an unfortunate way, but yet enable there to be sufficient discretion to pursue positive goals of innovation and so on and so forth. And this is really the imponderable at the heart of public procurement, which, to be honest, I don't think anyone has really got right. I'm not going to pick up the remedies points and so forth at the point, because we'll see how we go. Maybe we can pick them up at the end, but there's a danger that we end up launching another 2-hour session on the effectiveness of remedies, which we may, important though it is, we may not have time to look at. So let's move on, I think, to the next group of speakers who are going to look at different aspects of balancing the operation of public procurement in terms of delivering what is actually required from the particular contract with the wider social and other public goals which we're seeking to pursue, which are so important and which people expect their public procurement to deliver. We've got some key insights coming. So without more ado, let me start with Professor Joyce Liddell, Professor of Public Leadership at Newcastle Business School, who has an enormously impressive background in this area, but even more impressively, I'm told, swims 100 lengths a day, which is really quite terrifying. But I should have said that, but anyway, with that, Joyce, perhaps you can comment on balancing things up.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Haven't done much swimming this week, I have to say, because I've been involved in our National Public Administration Committee and running a few themes, but thank you, everyone. Michael asked us to stick with 3 main points. So I'm going to look very briefly at the Green Paper, talk quite a bit about stakeholders, end with metrics, and then Lee's kindly agreed to put up one slide that will reinforce what I've been saying, and I will keep within the time. So I would like to just concur with one of the earlier speakers actually who mentioned the green paper and how I think from stakeholder engagement it's very flawed, because to use an Andy Burnham, who's the Mayor of Manchester, for our international guests, to paraphrase him, he said that it's kind of classic of policy that's doing it to communities and stakeholders rather than with. And I'll just kind of end on that point, because I think that the green paper very much didn't involve the correct stakeholders before we thought about redesigning the system. That's my main point on the green paper. Now, turning to stakeholders, actually, there's very little understanding of stakeholders within public agencies. What I'd like to do is use local government, who I work with very, very closely on stakeholder engagement, and look at the internal and external aspects of stakeholder engagement, because there's a need for integration. Now, when you think about local authorities and they are integrating with their stakeholders, they're hierarchical organizations, they are multi-purpose, they are multi-level in different departments, and they're multi-professional. So when we think about procurement, procurement's very much a strategic and an operational function within local government, and it spans the whole organization. One of the problems is that when I work with local authorities, it's very difficult for them often to know who the other people are in the local authority. So for example, in procurement, you may be involved in procurement officers, financial directors, heads of service, frontline staff, and often these people don't even know each other. And so when you think about the virtual world that we're operating within, it was interesting looking at the Lebanese hierarchy and sort of organogram. And actually, if you look at a local authority, it's very similar to that. So very, very complex organizations. So internally, they need to understand their stakeholders. Externally, obviously, they have multi-diverse stakeholder communities. I spend the whole day talking about communities and how we define them, but I won't. So often what local authorities do is they rely very much on their existing stakeholder user groups rather than think through the whole issue of stakeholder engagement. And quite often these are very what I call episodic engagement rather than ongoing engagement, which you really do need when you're thinking about procurement. So I think stakeholders should have been involved in the whole design of the system, and I'll come to that later as well, at the very beginning rather than bring them in too late in the process, because this would easily avoid value leakage if we had a clearer understanding of engaging them. So stakeholder engagement then is dynamic, it's ongoing, it changes over time, it's about diverse voices, diverse communities who have different power and influence and are engaged differently. So what local authorities and other public agencies are trying to do, they're trying to prioritize and evaluate one voice against another voice and be as representative as they can, given that we live in a democracy. So they need to think about contingency, temporality, and spatiality when they're engaging with their representative stakeholder groups. If you're trying to design a system, you need to think about the level that you engage with, the frequency that you engage stakeholders in, and the nature of that engagement. Now, what I'm proposing, and I'll show you my slide at the end, is that we need to think about different devices and mechanisms, because we're dealing with very complex systems as to how to engage. And we need to do that throughout the whole system of procurement rather than at the end point when the user is asked, did you like what we did for you, etc., etc. So from the design right through all the processes of engagement within the system, within the procurement system, right to the outcomes, we need to think of new metrics, sorry, new devices and new mechanisms to do that. Which brings me actually to the final point, which is about metrics and measurement. There's quite a lot going on at the moment where Cabinet Office and other civil service departments are starting to engage with think tanks and starting to engage with academics to get some help on how they can design their systems and their metrics. And there are lots of academics now starting to work on, how we measure whether social value is being met, and how we think about, measuring what's happening in deprived communities, etc., etc. I was speaking at our national committee about this yesterday, actually. But I think if you want real engagement, just to reinforce the point, we need to engage a whole variety of stakeholders, but we first of all need to understand which ones are the ones that need to be involved in the process from beginning to end, from design to outcomes. And I think if Lee could put up my slide just to finish off if he can. I'm not capable of doing this. I'm so inept at this kind of thing. This is my slide, which is just saying how we can move from top-down and producer-driven models to a bottom-up citizen-driven. What public agencies tend to do, they tend to stick with the communication and the consultation. So in the communication, there's a one-way flow of information from service providers to stakeholders. In consultation, there's a two-way dialogue between them. But what I'm advocating, if you want to transform a system, you need to think about engaging the stakeholders in planning the system, designing the system, delivering the system, and measuring the system. So we need active involvement of various stakeholders in order to transform the procurement system. And as I say at the bottom there, if we think about strategic procurement and commissioning, we need to develop new metrics and new devices and new mechanisms in order to engage stakeholders from the design stage right through to the outcomes. And only then you will get adding social value. And I will stop there. I hope I was in time, Michael. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Joyce. That was fantastic. Sorry, my screen moved on me. I couldn't find my mute button. Keeping up the pace. So the next, I think Richard Simmons is with us, although I can't see his name. Yes, Richard, hello. Please, you are. Great, please take us away. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay, this has been a fascinating conversation so far all the way through, and we're delighted to be here. I'm Richard Simmons from the University of Stirling, and Joyce is with me on a project that we're working on that's funded by the UKRI, looking at optimising outcomes from procurement during COVID-19. It's a particular study thinking about what we've learned during the crisis and how we might apply it. And the question is about how we do optimise outcomes. And we're thinking about that in two different directions, really. One is in terms of how we optimise outcomes for communities. And of course, in that case, we do have to have the kind of stakeholder engagement that Joyce is talking about, and making sure that we're clear about what values are driving the value that we're seeking to achieve when we seek to optimise outcomes. But in terms of that, we're thinking about how procurement supports the drivers for achieving those outcomes. And in response to the various imperatives that arise from different things. During COVID, it's been keeping people safe, ensuring the continuity of services. It's been about supporting the local economy, promoting green recovery, and so on. But there are other issues now as we start to think about building back better that are emerging. There are lots of imperatives around reducing inequalities and thinking about the SDGs. There's lots of imperatives around fair work and so on. So we need to think about that. And this is where we're seeing procurement as governance, and actually seeing procurement playing a role actually as governance and taking its part in providing governance within communities, which involves a lot. And we're gathering a lot of data about what's been happening during the crisis and where to go next. So we're thinking about procurement very much as a lever for improving outcomes. And our data is showing that it's been an important lever. Lots of people are saying how procurement has served as an important lever for improving outcomes at the local level during the crisis. But also alongside that, there is a sense that when we pull that lever, how much power does it deliver? And actually it seems that it's a little underpowered at the moment. So there are ways very much that we can enable procurement to actually do a better job in terms of what happens when we pull the lever. And we see that we're investigating that through several different lenses. We're thinking about strategy. Yes, we're thinking about how that feeds into commercial and entrepreneurial approaches within local government. We're thinking about the relational approaches, which captures a whole range of actors, from users and communities right the way through to voluntary community, social enterprise sector, the private sector, our relationships with other local authorities, with other contracting authorities, relationships at the regional and central level as well. So we're bringing all of these understandings together in the project and talking to lots of people to say, how is procurement performing? Which is very much then thinking about the other side of the coin. One side, we've got the procurement as governance, but the other side of that coin then is about the governance of procurement and how we strengthen that as far as possible. So we're looking into that in a number of different ways in terms of how we combine different competencies and capacities and capabilities across the public, private, third sector boundaries, how useful relationships can be maintained. What do people need from each other? How can we make sure that they get them? How is the value proposition defined? Who's involved? How's it understood at different points of that commissioning, procurement, contract management cycle? How can we avoid value leakage as well? This is a very important point that's come up. Value does leak out of the system, particularly at the front end and the back end, it seems. So how do we avoid value leakage and actually think then about adding value, including meaningful social and economic and environmental value? And then what are the opportunities and challenges for local government data use is another really important part. So I'm really pleased to hear the conversation about data and how that's being included. And we see that's been incredibly important support across the end-to-end process. But in local government at the moment, there's a lot to be done to make sure that the data that's needed is there. So in terms of the law, we see this as an opportunity really to provide the skeleton that's needed to build on. We're very much at the soft tissue end of Caroline's analogy in terms of this, in terms of thinking through how things get applied. But we really do think it's important to use the reform process to achieve important goals of supporting the work that's being done on the ground. And so we're very interested in how that skeleton is constructed. And, you know, it's the next evolution of the law in the UK, I think, is an opportunity for us. I think we need to work together. And part of that dialogue, I hope, will be opportunities for the work that's emerging from the project to actually speak with those who are constructing the law and putting it together, and to, you know, hopefully we can make a contribution into thinking through what does good look like, and how can we link up that skeleton and make the soft tissue work in tandem. So that's hopefully what we're looking at with this project.
Fantastic, thank you, Richard. And then, tied in very closely with this, of course, the whole specific social value mission that's been a very important part of certainly local government procurement in the United Kingdom, if not before, certainly after the Public Contract Social Value Act came into effect a decade or so ago, nearly a decade ago. That has been a growing issue, and Julian Blake, the lawyer, but has been at the heart of the developing ways in which social enterprise can and third sector entities can engage with public procurement. It's a very important and challenging area, an area which a lot of thought has been given to. And I think it is interesting that at the moment you actually have England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland all very, very much engaged in delivering social value through public procurement, but all rolling out separate and different approaches to that engagement. It'll be interesting to see how this, as it were, worked experiment in social value in public procurement pans out. Julian, would you like to tell us a bit more about your perspectives in this area?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. So I'm coming from a practical perspective. I mainly work with service providers, and I'm offering a stakeholder perspective on how they experience procurement. I would say there are no issues with the rules. I agree with Malcolm very much on that, except one from this practical perspective. My concern is public services as opposed to commercial purchasing. They're different things, but the procurement rules cover them both. Public service commissioning is, procurement is only one part of public service commissioning. And it's a much bigger subject than just the commercial purchasing in an objective and transparent way. And so the one problem I have with the existing rules is it isn't express that there is a distinction between those two things. It is visible in the light touch regime, but the government's proposing to get rid of the light touch regime. So we'd be left with a regime if the Green Paper follows through without any sense that commissioning of public services is a particular thing that needs particular attention. And that really is leading us straight back into the major problems we have from a service providing perspective in relation to procurement, which is that it's implementation. As Alison Jones was saying, you've got to pay attention to implementation. All the problems that I observe are about interpretation and implementation. The rules themselves are purposive. I totally agree with Malcolm. You can see very conspicuously the intention to extend what is basically a competition law provision into the social domain and to incorporate social policy objectives, but that isn't really recognised in the Green Paper. And what we're trying to address from a service providing perspective is a dysfunctionality in commissioning. And a large part of that dysfunctionality comes from unprofessional, process-led, risk-averse, rigid adherence to procurement procedure and practice, and the lack of professional judgment around the complexities that need to inform how you best commission public services. So those are the real issues. It's that dysfunctionality of implementation that needs to be focused on, in my opinion, from this practical perspective. So what we're really talking about is how you realise the purpose of public services as delivering the best public value in meeting actual need. And there's a real core point, because actual need isn't really subject to market dynamics in the way that other goods and services might be. The need isn't determined by market. The market can possibly answer the need, but very often it doesn't. So we need something other than a market competition theory of how we're best going to deliver public services. We need things that have multi-party engagement, cooperation, prevention, integration, long-term improvement, resolution as the ultimate objective. All of those don't really fit within the narrow concept of short-term procurement cycles for service contracts. Now, Michael mentioned social value. That's a really core part of this, because social value at the moment, very good that it's being focused on. That in the UK started with the Social Value Act. It was already present in the European concept. And now it's got wide currency in the public sector. There's a risk of it being interpreted as a narrow thing, an added value thing. Now, an added value thing is excellent in terms of commercial purchasing. You purchase something and you get some added value on the side. You purchase a construction and there are some apprentice contracts associated with that. But in public services, social value is the thing. It's the whole thing. It's the inherent reason why you're entering into this arrangement with service providers. So that's a necessary corrective here that we're not quite reaching at the moment. Malcolm mentioned innovation and the European Commission's interest in innovation. That also is very important here. The reason I'm so exercised by this is because I've worked for many organizations that are very creative and very innovative. And the reality is you experience procurement as a barrier, because it assumes that the public authority already knows what it wants. It already knows what it wants. There's the consultation is part of it, but the initiation, the innovation needs to be more integrated than that. The stakeholders need to feed into that, and the pure procurement process, which we are stuck with in practice, doesn't help with that very much. So innovation does need to be released, and public procurement Mark II focused on the same things in the same ways won't achieve that. What I'm really talking about in public services is the need for a different concept to govern how you commission public services. Sometimes the market will work. Sometimes market competition is the answer, but very, very often it's not. It's about collaboration, it's about partnership, it's about all the stakeholders coming together who have a perspective on the best way to deliver public services. That's obviously the public sector, it's also the public benefit sector, it's also community engaged business, and they all have a concept, they all have an interest, a coincidence of interest in making public services work, and that can underpin the economy as well. It's not just a social thing. And so that idea that we're talking about collaboration and partnership, and we should have process that allows us to construct collaboration and partnership. Again, Malcolm said the European Commission recognised this. They introduced the concept of the innovation partnership, but it's barely been acknowledged in the UK as an opportunity to think about commissioning differently and procurement differently, since it's a procurement procedure. So we've had some interesting, innovative, courageous, creative examples of how innovation partnership in public services have been created. In Plymouth in health and social care, in Leicestershire in children's services, in Oldham in social prescribing, for example. And the point there is they've been constructed by thinking about who the stakeholders are, how you engage with the stakeholders, how you bring them all together. And that's very different to the rigidity of a traditional procurement process. So my real point is procurement needs to be recognised as part of commissioning. Commissioning needs to introduce a whole new concept of collaboration and partnership process alongside the procurement competition process. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. I think Julian's made a number of important observations there. Let me state a few things sort of taking up from that. I think one of the problems we have in any session like this, and when in any public procurement law reform, is that we treat public procurement because it addresses a particular problem, the purchasing by the public sector, as if all the markets we were dealing with are the same, and they're simply not. There are markets, I think, where it is probably the case that the public body can simply publish a notice and say, we need this. Who wants to sell it to us? And you don't need lots of interaction. People will queue up to sell the public body that. But most markets are different from that, and you get a whole range. And I think one of the topics, if I can make perhaps a slightly unpopular remark, in a number of important areas, if you're going to be building a railway, or a new high-tech IT system, or develop a new medical therapy for a public health service, the market does not work in any way that is really going to frame very, very, very sensibly around public procurement regimes. We're imposing a public procurement purchasing system on a market which just doesn't work that way. One of the problems, and this is which I think needs to be borne in mind, is that many of the people in those sectors will simply not come and play. They will not play the game with the public, with the country or the public sector or the public authority that is not running a tight, constrained process. If they think there's lots of discretion and uncertainty about the process and lots of goals being fed in, and they're not certain how it's going to work along the way because they see all of these exciting discretions, they simply won't participate. And so while it is admirable to talk about excessive focus on award procedures, one of the reasons why you need to focus on award procedures is if you don't, no one will participate in a number of the big procurements that we need to. One can talk about all these inputs, but there will be nothing to input into, because whether for good or ill, much of the stuff, the sort of markets we're talking about are areas where the public sector either never could provide the output, or in the last 20 or 30 years, its ability to do so has been privatized and devolved out. And so that not only is there, when we talk about stakeholders, it is important to think about the bidders. Those may be bidders who we don't necessarily think are always the worthiest individuals in society, but they are the people who are going to be doing the work, without which, frankly, none of this really means very much. So we do need to balance that issue, and that, I think, is an important sort of factor to be borne in mind in any of these discussions. We've got lots of comments. We may try and sort of repackage some of them as questions, but maybe before as I sort of draw together, Rory and I sort of draw together the key questions to come back to the panel, maybe I could ask Caroline to respond to some of the things that have been said so far with your wide experience, Caroline, in implementing these processes. Maybe you can pick up the 2 or 3 things that have struck you most forcibly from the comments and the chat.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm taking away, the main thing I'm taking away is, you know, we're looking at procurement almost as the eighth wonder of the world, because we're really going to do everything through procurement, and it's such a huge ask. And I know, as Gavin said, it's a third of public spending in the UK. In a lot of the countries I work with, it's much higher than that. It can be over half of public spending. And the potential that we have here is therefore enormous. But like everything, going from sort of strategic objectives to getting them operational is the challenge. And that's what we've heard. And I think the one thing I always talk about, and I've heard so much here this morning, is that the greater the discretion and complexity in the system, the more important data and transparency become, partly for the reasons that Michael has just said. If we want to engage with the potential suppliers, they have to know what's wanted of them. And one of the big innovations that UNCITRAL has tried to push through is that whatever you choose in terms of trade-off between maybe environmental criteria or your social value, because you can't do everything in each procurement, it's got to be clear and transparent so people understand what you want. And often, as Michael said, in the more complex procurements, you don't know exactly what you want, so you need the market innovation. The challenge with all of this is that, as has been very rightly said, how do you do it in practice and also in the reality of tight budgets? I have never met a procurement official who says, I've got all day to think about how I'm best going to do this. The whip is being cracked. I am judged on how quickly I get my processes through and how few problems there are. That is not a recipe for innovation. That's a recipe for the risk aversion that Julian just mentioned is a real issue. And we tend to, I think too, little things can make a big difference. The EU directives talk about the most economically advantageous tender. The GPA in the Green Paper talks about moving that to the most advantageous tender. And that's what UNCITRAL uses as well. It's absolutely right. This is not just economics. But if we're going to introduce it's not just economics, then we have to take on board that the costs of doing the process are higher. And as our colleagues from Lebanon said right at the beginning, how long do we have the political interest, the political will, and the budgets to carry on learning? I always see huge fanfares in procurement reform, money no object for the first period when you're dealing with the rules and the law and maybe setting up the institutions. And as we've heard, the political imperative changes. And so it's that consistency of attention. And I think events like this, we haven't got right answers to all of this. There are no right answers in procurement, let's be clear. But what we're doing is we're kicking around the ideas and the issues that we have to tackle. And I think the only thing that's constant in procurement is reform and ongoing change. And this is what these sorts of events can help us do. And the final point I'd like to make, Michael, is that procurement involves everything from infrastructure of every type, digital infrastructure, social infrastructure, and everything through to buying the laptops and the water for governments and so on. And you can't load everything at every level onto everything. And I think particularly the comment about SMEs that Malcolm made, and it's just not been enough of a priority. If you want to have the SMEs, and that obviously means all businesses in reality, but I'm talking about the smaller businesses here, you've got to think about your markets and segregating them and not overloading them with eco labels and accreditations for this and all the rest of it, because that really is another process challenge. So I think looking at your market and working out where you can do the various things best, rather than trying to say we're going to have everything in each procurement, and being a little bit, perhaps, if I may say so, less ambitious in some respects, could actually help us get there. And I just want to finish on transparency, open data, stopping looking at things as rules, but process steps to allow these things to be pulled together as this is what you need to do, not try and interpret what the rules mean in each time. And that's a real area where I think that the various government officials we've heard here have such a role to play, because we don't want people worrying about what the rules mean. We want them to be focusing on what they're trying to achieve. Thanks very, very much. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Caroline. So, and we can take this in a number of different ways. What I was going to do, it was go around, I'm not sure if we'll quite cover everyone on the panel, but I was going to simply ask you, those on the panel, to identify, as it were, the thing about either the UK or the Lebanese program that they think is the key thing, which is going to help achieve what they do want to achieve, and the thing that they think is missing. What's the thing that needs to be done that we've missed so far? You don't have to do both, but I'm going to invite you to think about that. While I'm giving you a moment or two to reflect on that, let me just pick up a couple of more of the points made. This topic about SMEs is really interesting, I think, because clearly, and it was a great part of the initiative that Malcolm put together, as tied in with innovation in 2014 to encourage SMEs. I think there's a difficulty, and I'll perhaps ask Malcolm to comment on this in a moment. I think there's a practical difficulty in that when one looks at it from a European perspective. At the one hand, you have, say, Germany, where with the Mittelstand, frankly, German SMEs probably don't need encouraging. The whole economy is based on this approach. But then you have more centralized states like France and Britain, where the tradition is so much for central entities to work with large central often collaboration becomes cover for working between central government and a few large entities. So sort of positive buzzwords, in fact, become Trojan horses for something very different. And in other countries, of course, there simply isn't an SME, there just isn't a vibrant SME culture that isn't going to be created. Just putting in place a public procurement law is not going to create that economy. And at least certainly in some cases I've been involved, that the SME buzzword is in fact a polite cover for corruption, because the SME is the local favorite. And how can public procurement achieve, is it realistic to achieve all of these positive economic goals that we should be able to deliver through SMEs and innovation programs, while bearing in mind all of the other problems that are associated with it? And so, without more ado, I'm going to lob that hospital pass at Malcolm and let you go.
You will let me go start on that. Good. Well, I just would point out a couple of things. First of all, about the legislation that stands at the moment, and where we have big challenges about it. I mean, first of all, is the complexity and intensity of the pre-qualification. And Caroline mentioned that just now. But actually, you can deal with that, first of all, by ensuring that SMEs who bid for contracts don't have to provide a whole lot of unnecessary information, which they only need to provide subsequently if they get awarded the contract. And that simplification of the process was actually challenged by member states, but we managed to get that through. Secondly, to actually give attention to the whole contracting process as to whether the contract itself and what you're asking for is simply SME unfriendly. And there are ways of doing this. And I think I particularly give credit to government digital services in the UK, who I think the last figures we saw are about 40% now of government digital contracts are going to SMEs, because they've adopted that policy of redesigning contracts and engaging SMEs in a more modular basis to deliver elements of it. And so it's a question of a change of mindset to encourage that. And that of itself will bring about some innovative solutions. So if I link that into the questions that you posed about what we need to do, I mean, what's striking at the moment is that we're seeing out of the government, we have a number of public procurement notices. We have a procurement strategy about extending the whole ambit of social value in all contracts. I mean, all of these have come pouring out. But where is the support programs? Where are the integrated programs? Where's the exchange of best practice? Where's the knowledge center that if I'm a local authority of a comparatively small size I want to go to, in order to provide me with the sort of support and best practice, that I can then go to my political leadership and say, the government has asked us to do this. This is the sort of practice we should be following. We've been talking to authorities over here already doing it to get rid of this risk aversion and contracting. I mean, Julian was very clear about that earlier on. So at the moment, we have a whole lot of ideas floating around. We have an innovation strategy, which I welcome because it talks about procurement as part of that. We have a separate social value initiative, which has been running under the Social Value Act for 8 to 9 years now. But if you look at my report for the Local Government Association, there has been no linkage whatsoever between the Social Value Act and innovation procurement tools at all. They run in entirely separate silos. And so if government wants to deliver what's in the Green Paper and in the subsequent legislation, we have to have more integration and sharing together. And that seems to be a message that's come through very strongly from our colleagues in Lebanon. So, I mean, if they can actually take that broader view, why can't we do that at a government level?
Thank you, Malcolm. So let me turn to Gavin. I've got a couple of questions really, but turn back to you. Just on the chat. I hope you're still there, Gavin. One question from Mary Patel about tax information, and this is an interesting area. It's one area where there is a reference in the exclusion grounds in the legislation currently, but there's only very rare that tax becomes a feature of exclusion. Other areas are becoming problematic around poor about anti-competitive conduct in the past, about poor performance issues in the past. These are always difficult issues for any authority to grapple with. And I wondered if you had any comment about how improving data might enable authorities to take a more, as it were, instrumental approach in considering how tax issues might, or tax failures by providers might be inputted into the decisions. And a sort of link, or a different point, what about data regarding subcontracting? Are we able to, within the Open Data Project, able to work up processes where we can look at whether or not subcontracting to SMEs is in fact as good as, if not, it might in some cases be a better way of promoting SMEs by ensuring that those entities that contract directly with the public sector are encouraged to subcontract, and that is a way of dynamizing the market. Gavin, that and any other points which you think you need to respond to in the course of this provocative morning.
Yeah, it's been such a rich discussion. I think what's fascinating is obviously we started talking about the kind of standard procurement, but then we got into our planning and implementation and value of the joined up design to capture the right information at the right time around all those processes. And I think the overarching having a strategy to drive that change and foster kind of continual stakeholder engagement was what we really heard from the Lebanese story. That's something I think we're all feeling. We want to see that next level of that in the UK, right? Just like I think it was flagged, where's the EGP strategy for the UK to actually digitize things to help people on the front line, but also to unlock that information that Mary and others really care about. So I think we then spoke about the social value, and again, now we're talking about having joined up information across the commercial life cycle. Then yes, you need to measure those social value criteria, have a fair way of tagging and applying them, and then monitoring who's doing it well, what the actual outcomes from public contracts are, right? And then feeding that back into better planning in future. So it's not, there are good examples of other people doing this around the world. On the tax information, there's the proposal around beneficial ownership information. Obviously, the UK is one of the first countries to collect. They call it the persons of significant control behind public companies. Obviously, in procurement, you need to collect that for foreign entities that are bidding and winning as well. You can do that with a well-designed, digitized system, but it needs to be well thought through, and then not too much of a burden that excludes SMEs. So trade-offs are what we've been talking about. It's all possible. It is being done elsewhere in the world. I think we all want that push, all of us, to engage the UK government systematically on thinking that through to really get this green paper to the win that could then give you the end-to-end following of the money and the spending and the outcomes in a user-centered way that isn't just extractive and like more things for people on the front line to type into, but actually is part of the business process of procurement. It's like, oh, we haven't published the contract. I was talking to people in just local authorities, and their procurement system doesn't say to people, SMEs, oh, you haven't uploaded this document, or this is missing, or all they get is just a set of PDFs that are just like beamed to them that they have to wade through. So designing around the business process and then sharing this information seems very vital. And of course, subcontracting should be part of that as well.
Gavin, thank you very much indeed. Perhaps in fairness, but in the interest of balance, I should let Sam jump in here to respond or comment on topics so far.
Thank you, Michael. And absolutely, it's a rich conversation, as Gavin was saying. There's a huge amount going on here, so I can't comment on everything. What I would say, though, is absolutely the data points that people are making, I think, are really ringing true to me. And I think Caroline's comments about trying to be practical and kind of making suggestions that are kind of, things that we can kind of implement in relatively, low effort and low kind of organizational reorganization is something that is actually quite difficult and challenging. So I absolutely agree with her comments. I think from my perspective, one of the key things that we've been trying to do over a number of years in government has been to fix the kind of the data back end, if you like. We call it things like fixing the plumbing. The data that's floating around the system that's used to make these decisions is no surprise that it kind of is collected in different ways, it's shared in different ways. There have been all kinds of issues and blockers to that. So I think some of the kind of comments coming through from this conversation, it feels like very much are around kind of improving the quality of that information, improving the kind of consistency of approaches. And so for me, that really rings true. And I think that there's a huge amount of great work happening outside government from organizations like Gavin's, I'm thinking of organizations like Spend Network as well, people that are picking up the data and using it to kind of understand more closely the decisions that the government is making around procurement, and then using that data to then inform further decision making that's being made in government. And I think that in order to do that in the most optimal way possible, that kind of fixing the back end, fixing the data question is something that keeps coming back again and again. So I feel like we're making quite a bit of progress in this space. I know that there's quite a bit in the green paper that talks about this as well. And so I just wanted to kind of, reflect on that as a kind of very positive point. I think some of the more specific points around kind of governance obviously are above my pay grade. So not appropriate for a civil servant to comment on that necessarily, but I think there is a huge amount of really great work happening. And I think that hopefully collectively as a community here, we'll start to see a lot more kind of good quality information, lot better kind of decision-making data out there that can hopefully drive, the civil society side and the private sector side to kind of see that we're doing things in a more appropriate, transparent and kind of accountable way going forward. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Sam. Right. I'm not sure we'll get to cover everyone, but picking up a few more of the questions. There's been a lot of very positive response to the Lebanese experience, which Basma and Lamia explained to us. I thought maybe, is it fair or unfair if I ask one or other or both of them to maybe pick up on that positive response? Really think, well, what is the two questions? What's the feature? How is it they think that they think their law has or their project has sort of identified a point which we've been able to deal with and has, as it were, a solution? Maybe the unfair question is, what's the thing that keeps them up at night thinking, gosh, we now realize we might have been able to do something different or better? What are we going to change the next time round? If only Caroline had remembered to tell us that was how we were going to do it different, should have done it differently. So I don't know which of you would like to have a crack at it. Lamia, do you want to have a crack at that?
Well, I'll try. Thank you, Michael, for the questions. There are many things that keep us awake at night, and especially with all the cuts in electricity. But Caroline's advice are extremely interesting. We did we did a lot of reading and benchmarking and getting to know what's going on around the world, helped, of course, by lots of colleagues from the Sigma, OECD, from the World Bank, from the UN, who are working and have been working on this issue. The point here is that whether you are in the north or the south, there are so many lessons out there to grab. And if you're open enough to learn from the lessons of the world, you can do really a good job, minding the gaps of failures. And this is what we do. And I think what we did, and this is probably one of the most interesting part of the work for our project. Now, during the work, we did a lot of literacy, let me call it procurement literacy. And I think we do underestimate the importance of emphasizing procurement literacy, not only for procurement professionals. Procurement professionals do not need to be literate about procurement as in that sense. Where we need to do a lot of work is among public sector leaders, because they don't see it as strategic. Politicians, parliamentarians, ministers. I've worked a lot with ministers, parliamentarians, and even prime ministers. And believe me, they don't understand it. Yes, at the political level, it's underestimated, as Michael pointed out. Yes, it is underestimated. It is not underestimated by those who know that it is a gold mine for mismanagement. So there is here a duality. So investing in literacy here can have a lot of gains, because you would understand the capacities to better manage the funds, but also the opportunities for procurement and how for misprocurement and how corruption and mismanagement takes place. Procurement is a leeway for corrupt politicians and for dismantling the essence of governance in a country. And I think this is what we learned throughout these lessons. And I think we owe it to the world to transmit it. All these fortunes that you see for corrupt politician is mostly linked to public procurement, and the citizens should be there at the forefront, working with the anti-corruption community and linkages, cross-sectoral linkages. So what keeps us at night? So we're trying to walk in a mine, in a landmine here. Especially in the conditions of Lebanon, the strength is that the community is at a point where corruption is not tolerated because it came to kind of explode the city. The port of Beirut explosion was mostly because of corruption and mismanagement and toleration of corruption and of mismanagement by the private sector. And this is today a phase that is going to end with hopefully not a violent conclusion. So I'll stop there. Maybe Basma has something else to add.
Basma, did you have anything you wanted to add to Lamia's comments? If not, you're Basma. Yes, here we are.
Yes, thank you. I would just to add very briefly about the stakeholder engagement on the reform. And this is something very important that started from day one with a national consultative exercise before the MAPS assessment and then with the MAPS assessment. Now that the law was enacted and published, we are preparing for its implementation. We have 12 months of hard work, of a lot of steps to be achieved in order to bring the society, the economy, and public sector to be ready in 12 months to enter this law into force. So stakeholder engagement will be further accelerated and with focus on 3 main points. The first one is to bring all together towards a common vision for reform with a national action plan that was drafted with the support of AFD and World Bank, and to give, now it's time to bring consensus on this national action plan for on the short and medium term. Second point is building capacities across the line, not only public sector, but also private sector, prepare the market, prepare civil society to monitoring and transparency issues. And this is a capacity building strategy, and action plan is also being cooked, and also consultation will come after. And the third one is the e-procurement strategy that will pave the way towards e-procurement practices in the future, but at the first stage will put the grounds and the foundation of the online platform for procurement that will allow us to put Lebanon on the correct track of open data and of transparency. This is practically. So these are the steps that we are working hard to achieve in the coming 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Basma. I think we're running out of time, so I better perhaps cut everyone short and just to wrap up the session, because I know that Rory will want to give us to take us forward into the next session. Firstly, it's important that I remind everyone to go back to the feedback form, which Lee put up somewhere in the chat. And Lee will probably put it up again just to remind you. It was 11:20 in the chat if you want to find that. So obviously that's important. I hope you'll agree. This has been a very stimulating session. It's a session which defies some neat summary or into one or two neat little bullets. And has provoked some very interesting material in the chat. Indeed, I hope we can preserve the chat as well, because there's a lot of very interesting material there. I think it simply goes to prove what I always say to students at the beginning of a year studying public procurement law. One of the exciting things, but one of the challenging things about public procurement is that there are so many topics to talk about, and we still, I think, fail. There is a failing, I think. I mean, it is, I'm afraid, a failing of the current UK reform initiative, really to identify all the threads that need to be borne in mind and to balance all of those different threads. We do all come to this area with different perspectives and different past experiences. And one of the difficulties we have with any of these legislative arrangements is that they don't necessarily, in a clear and transparent way, pull together all of the different goals and explain how they're going to be balanced together. So it is important that we meet at events like this, virtually or physically, and think about how we improve things going forward and how we ensure that these regimes do meet the very important social and public goals, all the way from anti-corruption to social and economic development. Without more ado, I'll shut up and thank the speakers. If we can all thank the speakers in the customary fashion, or whatever has become customary in your world in these new and exciting times, so that we don't crash the sound system. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been great. Well done for keeping to time. And the only person who hasn't kept time is me. So I've given Rory about 10 seconds in which to do his important sign-off material. Rory, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the panelists. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful role as chair. I do want to say that if you want to keep this conversation going, there are opportunities to do so. Well done, everyone, and like surviving 2 hours of Zoom. Ways to keep this forward include joining the POGO Club, the Oxford POGO Club. POGO is the Procurement of Government Outcomes, and we have sessions about once a month talking about different issues. So it is really helpful for you to fill out the evaluation survey that Lee has shared, because that'll help us inform what POGO sessions we do. Another way to continue this work is to make comments on the National Action Plan Keith was talking about and Sam was talking about. That's the Open Government Partnership, the National Action Plan that the UK is developing at this time. But what's next? This was the first session in a conference. You know, we've got exciting things happening in the course of the conference, including a speech from a Nobel Prize winning economist. We've got 2 more sessions on public procurement tomorrow. Anne Davies, who's here in the room, is going to be sharing some sessions around awarding an outcomes contract, as well as
using public procurement to build back better. So hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. What's happening immediately is that the people in this room are all welcome to come and have coffee, and we'll hopefully get to chat more about this. Then we will allow breakout rooms to happen if people have more appetite to hang out on Zoom. There's some breakout rooms that'll happen shortly. But then we're going to come back at 12:45, I think, which is in with just over an hour. And we're going to hear from Myra Eroldi, who's going to kick off the conference and put everything into full swing. So thank you very much, and well done, panelists. Thanks very much to Jamie and Fred, and who's managed the AV in such a way that we haven't been super aware of the mixed things. But you're all very welcome. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow and later on this afternoon. Thank you. Right, are people moving to their Zoom rooms?